I loved it.
Thanks, Joe. I think we better do a roll call
All right, so Ken Healy,
here.
Dallas Elliott.
Here.
Crier.
Here.
LaRue.
Here.
Rayburn.
Here.
Condi.
Here.
Bowen.
Here.
Kadian.
Here.
Nobody online today.
No.
That's why I did that.
That was a 1 hour with the foothills look like Ireland.
So the next order of business of the minutes from our last meeting, has everybody had a chance to review them, and are there any comments or questions, corrections? So do I hear a motion to approve them? So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Next order of business is, I don't know if you want to take it.
Yeah, so committee members and Billy, we're lucky to have Boise State University here. It's been probably 2 years ago now. This committee approved funding for a soil carbon sequestration project. And some of the members were here, but they'll kind of talk through what they did, how it went, and I just thought it would be really good for you to kind of see full circle some of the research that's coming back that I think will be really beneficial for us as land managers to help make decisions as we go down the road. So it's not, it's just another piece of what this committee is able to approve and do. So I will turn it over to Dr. Guba. And maybe just, introduce yourself, and some of the new committee members too that probably don't know.
Sure, so my name is Marielle de Graaf. I started at Boise State in 2010, and I am now a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences and an associate dean for research at the College of Arts and Sciences.
Yeah, hi everyone, Richie Holder, I'm the master's student on this project, I'm working on it for about 2 years, so excited to share what we found with you all.
And I also want to say that Kelly Hopping is a professor at Boise State University, and she has been integral to this project, and she can't be here today, but I want to make sure to remember her name as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk about soil carbon in general a little bit. I'm going to talk about how much is stored in soils across the city of Boise Open Space Reserve, why we should care about it, and if there's a possibility to increase it. So I'm going to give you a general background of it. And then Richie is going to pop in and he's going to talk about what it is that the team did out in the field and what our results are showing so far. To be able to try to get numbers. There we go. So the first thing I want to just talk about is what is soil carbon? And if you look at this picture, it's the black stuff that's in soil that is carbon, and it comes from dead plants and animals that are dying in the soil. It comes from both the plants that are on top of the soil as well as from the roots that are in the soil. And soil carbon accumulates over time. So if you think about the soil not being soil yet, but giant rock, then this rock starts to break down at some point because of weather events, freeze, thaw, fires sometimes, and it starts to break into little pieces, get sand, get silt, clay, those are minerals of the soil. It's not really a soil yet until biological activity comes into that soil in the form of mosses or plants, and then they bring that carbon into the soil and you get this more spongy material. If you go to the Home Depot and you buy potting soil, then there's a ton of carbon in it because it's got a ton of plant material in it. It's nice and spongy, you can hold a lot of water and nutrients. So there's different amounts of carbon in the soil in different ecosystems across the world. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the biological processes that lead to more or less soil carbon so that you can understand the results that Richie is going to show to you and the equations for
Guys, sorry.
Yeah.
Does peat have so much carbon in it? Is that a function of it being so spongy?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, and so that can hold so much water and it's pretty much a whole plant material and it's the most carbon.
And just for our new members, I apologize, this is Martha Brady, she's our restoration specialist, for the city.
And I will have lots of questions, so.
And she used to be in one of my.
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
I went to Boise State, a decade ago.
I didn't want to talk about it.
I know.
All right, so we're going to do a little soil carbon storage 101 thing here. So how does carbon come in soil? That's really what I want to talk about, and how does it accumulate or not? So the amount of carbon that sits in soil is very similar to the amount of money you have in your bank account. It's whatever comes in, whatever goes out determines how much is there. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what drives what goes in and what drives what goes out. And then we'll talk about that for the details. So the amount that comes in ultimately comes from the atmosphere because plants photosynthesize, they take up CO2 and put it in their tissues. That's every plant is about 40% carbon, or carb heavy. Carbon falls onto the soil, gets incorporated through organisms into the soil, like right now, the leaves are falling off trees. And it also gets into soil through plant roots, actually, the most important way. It gets into soil through plant roots, you just can't see it. But the same thing that happens above ground actually happens in the soil. Okay, so once the carbon is in the soil, there's soil organisms. This is not drawn to scale, they're tiny. But carbon is an incredible, important carbon source or energy source for these organisms. And so they take it off and they process the litter of plants that comes into the soil and they create a sticky material that's sort of organic matter, humus. It's the stuff that you see again in the potting soil of Home Depot, for example, or any potting soil. I'm not here. Okay, so then the microbes create carbon dioxide in the process of metabolizing this carbon byproduct, and that gets released out of the soil. So the amount of carbon that we have in soil depends on how much is brought in through photosynthesis and through leaves and plant roots, and how much is released from the soil through microbial respiration. And so when we try to understand carbon in soil, that's kind of how we make hypotheses about it. How much do we think there's going to be in these different places?
Or do you mean?
So if the carbon input is greater than output, you get more soil carbon, and if output is greater than input, you get less soil carbon. Now, one of the things that makes soil carbon so important is because there's a lot of it. If you look across the world, there's 2,400 gigaton of carbon. And that's a lot of carbon. I did a little search on Google to try and relate it to things. And so 1 gigaton of CO2, so that's related to carbon, right? It's just you need to put oxygen away. Is like 211 million passenger vehicles or 134 million US households, and I like that 200 million outlet stretching from the Earth. So that's a lot. That's really, and that's in the top 2 meters of soil. So you can imagine that if carbon comes in through CO2, right, and it goes out through CO2, it's going, any change in that amount of carbon in the soil is going to affect the climate because it affects atmospheric CO2 concentration. So, and we know that carbon dioxide concentrations and global temperatures are linked. So when carbon doesn't sit in the soil, when we take it out of the soil, when we put more in the soil, it's going to impact global temperatures. And so this, if you think about the climate action plan of the city of Boise, then this project, I think, was linked to that directly because it is so important to understand how much carbon is in the soil to be able to understand whether you can be carbon neutral by 2050. And so, some of the work that we do will actually inform if there's management practices that can help put more carbon in the soil, and that can offset some of the emissions that we have. So, and when we talk about emissions, if you think about this is not voicing only, this is annual global CO2 emissions from fossil fuels is 8.9 gigaton of carbon. So this carbon normally sits in the soil where it is biologically used or at a very, very slow rate, if we go in and we, pull it out to use it for important things like drinking water. But the amount that is relative to the total amount is that little red dot compared to, the big green circle. So it's a fraction of the total amount of carbon that we have. And so some scientists at some point said, well, if we can take 8.9 over 2400, we have 4 per mil, and if we can increase soil carbon storage by 4 per mil, so a little, very small amount, then we can offset greenhouse gas emissions. I don't think, this is just my thought, there should still be work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it is nice to know that maybe the soil can be a contributor to reducing atmospheric CO2. Okay, so what is happening in our open space reserves? And I hope that this makes a little more sense in terms of carbon now. So you see on the left picture, sagebrush, steppe that's healthy, it's not been burned, that doesn't have a lot of cheatgrass, and then you see the cheatgrass right after burn. We all know that stuff. So what happens now is you go from a big shrub, sagebrush, to a tiny little grass that turns over quickly and puts almost no carbon in the soil. So if you think about your carbon budget, the carbon in and carbon out, we just reduced our carbon by quite a lot. So one of the questions that we ask is, how much carbon is associated with all these different plants? And we have more plants than just these two. These are the two end members. That's like the worst they can get, and that's maybe for carbon purposes, the best they can get. And then we have a bunch of stuff in between. And that is where Richie is.
Yeah, thank you, Mariano. So first, to start off this study, we essentially broke down different vegetation types that are located in our foothills into 4 groups. So we can see as the top left, we have a perennial group, so things like our native forests, things of that nature. On the right, there is a plant species that is used for erosion control after fire. On the bottom left, there's our shrub species, and then on the bottom right, we have our invasive annual grasses like our medusa head, spargy grass. Part of the reason why we chose to split these plants up into different groups is their above ground, below ground characteristics. So as we can see on the far left, our sagebrush, we have a really large above ground biomass associated with this big taproot that goes very deep into the soil column. And we can see in the middle, we have our different, those are perennial native species, which also have a lot deeper roots compared to our invasive cheatgrass. On the far right, we can see a very tiny amount of biomass in the above ground and an even smaller amount in the below ground in its root system. So when we look out to the foothills, we can see that there's a complex mosaic of plant species. On the right side, we can see that there's bare ground, there's shrubs, there's forests, there's grasses mixed in there. Now, the same complexity is also located when we look at the landscape as a whole. There's different soil types, there's different aspects, there's different exposures. Because of that complexity, it requires that we do a lot of sampling. So as we can see here, this is a map of the 7 different open space reserves that we sampled at. We sampled at 3 of the higher elevation reserves, that being Stack Rock, Hawkins Range, and Noble Reserve. And 4 different low elevation reserves, Polecat, Hillside to Hollow, Camel's Back, and Military Reserve. So we're gonna look at Polecat Gulch Reserve just a little bit closer to see how we broke our sampling down. So we can see here, these are all our different sampling points that were generated across the reserves area. And we split this down by 3 different categories. The first being a vegetational map that was designed by Ecosystem Services that essentially shows the 4 different major plant communities that are located at this reserve. We then justified to break our sampling down further by including different factors that impact soil carbon. That being different soil types that are located across the reserve and different aspects. The aspects are important because the north facing slopes generally have cooler temperatures or water moisture associated with those, so more soil carbon is expected to be at those sites, and along with that, larger plant species.
It's a good question.
Yes.
The first, kind of color mapping, yes, this
Yes.
was, is that satellite based?
Yeah, so it was generated by like satellite based at like a 10 meter resolution by Ecosystem Services, yeah.
Okay, and is that like seasonal or is that an average over the?
Yeah, that was an
Year.
average over, I believe it was 2020. Will be better.
Yeah, it was developed utilizing ground truthing as well as satellite imagery. And LiDAR, and that's how they kind of determined these different vegetation types, because they had aerial imagery associated with LiDAR, so the shrubs
Oh, they
they were
did
able to
it with
identify.
drones?
Yeah.
Oh, nice, okay.
Yeah. It was
Yeah.
pretty cool.
And our project is also able to kind of check how the accuracy of these maps, which is kind of cool. Kind of.
Thank you.
So here we would approach a hypothetical sampling location. You can see that there's a bunch of different species located at this vegetation plot. When we would approach one of these sites, we would then find the median point and put down our stake into the ground. We would then run two 10-meter transects out on either side, and we would take a soil sample underneath plant species that we would like to investigate for that plot. We would then take that soil core and we would basically dissect it into 3 different sections, that being 10 centimeter increments, essentially to see the depth of, soil carbon across the depth. So this project took a lot of physical work for a lot of people. The, I guess, physical nature truly can't be understated. I had a fantastic team to help me. We hiked about 173 miles, we estimated, we took about, I think it was 1,137 pounds of soil, like throughout all of our sample. So just a lot of physical work from a lot of fantastic people. I'm truly indebted to for their work on this. So if we can look at just some photos from the field work here, we can see on the far left, this is us setting up one of our sites. You can see that we have our two 10-meter transects laid out. One of our workers on the project, the lab manager at the DeGraaf lab, is taking vegetation samples on the far left. And then 2 of the other workers are currently taking the soil core samples at that spot. And you can see in the middle, I'm instructing one of the city hires, Dylan, as to why and how we basically separate our soil cores out into 10 centimeter increments. And then on the far right, we can see me posing for a photo while my crew diligently works behind me. Yes, absolutely. I'd also like to draw your guys' attention to the difference between the left and the middle photo. On the left photo, this is from a northwest aspect. You can see that there's just a lot of nurtured plant species located there versus our middle photo, which is from a southwest aspect, which has just a lot more heat exposure and things of that nature. So a lot smaller plant species at that location. So after all of these samples were collected from the foothills, we then stored all of our samples into a large walk-in fridge, and then as we were processing them, we would dry them out for 48 hours. Then we would remove all of the moisture content out of the soil. That soil sample then we put through a 2-millimeter sieve, and then we would painstakingly pick out all of the roots and the rocks from the soil sample and separate those into 2 different bags. Those bags were then weighed for their biomass. For the root samples and the rock samples, the weights and the densities were taken. Then further, once we had a complete soil sample, we would then take a smaller subsample of that soil, grind that down into fine powdery dust, and then we would use that for further carbon analysis at a different location at BSU. That carbon would come back to a percent carbon measurement, and then we'd use that percent carbon measurement in association with the density of the soil, basically to say, for this known volume, there's this much carbon. at this volume, and then that allows us to go back out to the gigaton metric that we heard about earlier. So this is what a lot of our samples would look like. You can see that there's a lot of fun rocks and roots in some of the samples. That would make for a very fun time for processing, but also different shades and different concentrations of those rocks and of those roots. Not all tube samples are alike. And here we can see a difference in two of the different samples we took. So on the left, that is a sample from Milbo Reserve, which is one of our higher elevation sites. We can see that sort of be a lot darker color compared to a sample from Hillside to Hollow, which is one of our low elevation sites. And we can see that to be more of a fine, I guess I would almost consider like a gray or dusty color sample. So this is the preliminary data that we have to show you all. So this is a map of carbon content on the left axis. And on the bottom axis here, we have our different vegetation categories. So on the left, we have our annual shorts, our invasive category. On the, I guess, next to the invasives, we have our planted species that the city uses. Then we have our perennial grass species in the purple, and then we have our shrubs in the green. So our shrubs have a significantly higher carbon storage across all of our different reserves compared to all of our other vegetation types. One of the other cool things that has come out of this analysis is that we have found that there is more carbon the further away you are from trail network system. So this study was not designed to specifically find that, but it's just kind of a cool takeaway that we found from a project here. So this is currently a map of Reynolds Creek, and this is what the end point is going to be for this project. So we will basically show a map of soil carbon. This was produced by Dr. Pearson from the US Forest Service, and it shows soil carbon across the Reynolds Creek experimental area, where that carbon is located and where it is not. And that is going to be the endpoint that we're going to produce for you to basically inform management decisions. Thank you very much.
Anybody have questions? Yes.
On this, how the carbon is released from the soil, there's one way that happens, what is it called?
Microbial respiration, there's actually two ways, I just didn't want to go into biology of all of it, but plants also respire carbon. But the microbial respiration, like from soil bacteria and fungi, is the biggest loss of carbon from the soil.
Which is, there's no real activity, it's just sitting there freeze off, maybe the temperature causes that at least?
So, yeah, so the microbes are, so imagine a piece of plant material going into the soil, that's gonna be eaten by the microbes. And in the process of just metabolizing, they release CO2. If it gets cooler, then they, or if the soil gets more moist, they will grow harder. Plants also will grow bigger when the soil is moist, and that's like the biggest limiting factor. So, plants here, because they're so starved for water, you tend to see that if water goes off in an ecosystem, that plants get bigger and put more carbon in the soil relative to how much more microbes respire. Does that make sense? So the abiotic factors like freezing and stuff like that have an impact on microbes and on the loss of carbon from the soil, but not directly, it's indirect through their impact on microbes.
So it's safe to say healthier soil is better for holding more carbon and not releasing it?
Yeah, and so healthy soil is a really biggest thing because what is considered healthy in like an agricultural
For
system?
plants.
Yeah, would not be healthy in our system because we'd be having a lot of cheap grasses, we have very healthy soils, like we need kind of a poor soil actually. That where nutrients don't cycle too fast. In a agricultural system, you want fast cycling of nutrients, so plants can take it on and grow really big. here we have our native plants who have adapted to live in a really crummy situation. And so if we start throwing nutrients onto the soil or get, a situation where we get too much fertility, which is often considered healthy, then we get species like cheatgrass that have evolved to grow really fast with a lot of nutrients, and so that's not good. So while sagebrush has more carbon, it also makes the nutrients cycle slower, so more carbon associated with sagebrush is good. Have a lot of carbon because you put potting soil down from Home Depot, that would be bad because then that's too good for our system. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Quick question. I remember when we first talked about this, part of the goal of this project was to have an understanding of roughly how much carbon we were saving from being released into the atmosphere by protecting these like swaths of the foothills. So when you guys are done with the project, will we be able to know that, and how is kind of that? I know it's like such a barbaric way to think about it, but I just feel like it's helpful for us.
Totally. So the way you can, we are not going in and measuring CO2 loss. The way we can tell you that is because what we're measuring in the carbon is the net impact of input and output. So we will be able to say under sagebrush, we have this much, under a perennial species, we have this much. So the net loss difference is this much percent. So we'll be able to give you that. Yeah, excited. Yeah.
I have two questions. This is super interesting and is very related to my work, so that's cool. So when you showed the plants with the depth of the roots, and I don't know if this is necessarily represented, but the sagebrush was not only deep but very thick roots. So is there a relationship between like the thickness of the roots or the root inches, right? Because like some of these fan out much more. Is there a correlation between like depth and then the amount of roots? And how much carbon they can fit in?
Yeah, so I guess there's two major differences I'd say between like sagebrush and our different grasses, let's say. So one being like fine roots. So there's basically tiny little root hairs that will stick out on some more plant species. And those that have a lot of one thing about carbon. And the other factor that I would say is that like sagebrush roots are a lot more woody. So they can woody.
Oh, yes,
So
okay.
they decompose a lot slower in cycle, a lot slower in that system compared to like a grass root where that really has a lot quicker over in comparison.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and so actually in our lab, this is not related to this particular project, but we have another, because I'm fascinated by plant roots. We have a project where we grow switchgrass and big blue stem in Illinois. And we have different genotypes of these plants that all vary in their root structure. And so some have very fine fibrous root systems and some are worse. But they don't have the major differences that Richie was just talking about. It's sort of trying to understand how the fibrosity of a root system impacts carbon.
Yeah.
And what we are finding is that a more fibrous root system puts more carbon into the soil and it tends to stay there longer too. So.
Thank you. And my second question was, so you said that this is a snapshot of in and out, right? So was there, and I know Reynolds Creek is being studied about everything in it, but has there been any carbon studies before it and after it to maybe monitor changes that could maybe be representative of the whole landscape of the foothills?
Yeah, so carbon changes at a very, very, very slow rate. So we'd have to go back 20 years from now, maybe
Yeah.
we'd find that change, unless there's a fire that goes through, and actually we are going to send in Polecat fire. And we'll be able to see, because we sampled the Polecat, so we'll be able to actually use those samples and the samples from after the fire. And we'll just do a quick scan and I'm sure we're gonna find a difference, and that will be really interesting because that carbon is gonna change quickly because it's like ashes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Over.
Can you talk a bit more about it, was there sampling, was it a random sample stratified aspect or something?
Yeah, so it was basically stratified by different factors that we found were extremely important for soil environment, so it was stratified by this different combinations of our vegetation types, for different soil types and different aspects, just kind of randomly generated for those combinations across all those groups.
And this is a random material.
Yeah, using all this different kind of mapping stuff. Randomly generated points that I get to go hike out into.
And then sometimes the vegetation you expected to be there wasn't there.
Yes, yeah, would not be there just due to inaccuracies in the vegetation map, and then, you kind of begrudgingly pipe to the next, to the next sampling point to restart the process.
You had to go to all this trouble and research to find out that cheatgrass really is bad.
Well, and I think one of the interesting things too, when we talk about like land management, you know, I think looking at the grasses that Martha plants already, are there other choices we can make to hold more carbon in the soil? And so that was, for me, surprising as how close the grasses are that we have, that we're planting are not really holding as much carbon.
And by grasses that we've planted, it means grasses that were perhaps inappropriately planted at one point in time based on different mentalities. So for example, as military reserve is covered in intermediate cheatgrass, which was likely seeded by the BLM at one point in time due to his history of grazing in that area. Another nice example is cereal rye, which is a very invasive grass in the foothills that was planted by municipalities for erosion control and has since escaped. So those aren't necessarily, those are not choices that we are making anymore, but they are still pervasive in the foothills and very challenging to revert to a different vegetation type at this point in time.
That's related to what you just mentioned. What are you using now for mitigation areas based on what you've learned?
So seeding success with grasses is very, very challenging due to the competitive pressure with invasive annuals like cereal rye and cheatgrass and all the others. I typically use 4 different perennial bunch grasses depending on where we're planting. It depends on the soil types, different grasses like different soil types. But sandbird bluegrass is one that's very commonly recommended by scientists in the US Geological Survey because it's small stature, so fire resistant and resilient. And also can be highly competitive with cheatgrass, particularly after disturbance. Blue bunch wheatgrass is a very common native perennial grass, wild brush swirltail. And those are the 3 that I use the most often. Then if it's a sandier soil, I'll use different types. If it's closer to water, I'll use different types. So there's no one size fits all.
Yeah, and also, we stratified by all the things that Richie said, and the graph that you saw was based on all of the data from all the reserves compiled together. So if you can imagine, there is a huge amount of variability in soil carbon across that range, right? So the fact that the sagebrush comes out still as storing the most carbon means that it has a huge effect because it's statistically significant, even though we see all this variability. Richie is now looking at each reserve independently to see if there's maybe at a lower elevation, there is a difference between the grasses. And we see that perennials really are storing more carbon compared to cheatgrass, but maybe it's a wash at higher elevation reserves because of different climatic conditions. So, so that's something that we hope to be able to report on next time.
And, I'm sorry, go ahead.
This is actually a question for you. Since we've owned Hawkins Range, that was grazed for every year for over 100 years.
Yes.
What difference have you seen in the last 7 years or 8 years?
So
What transition has been made?
none, unfortunately, no positive changes in my opinion. From observational, I don't have data to support these observations, but the grasses seeded for forage are highly competitive. So intermediate wheatgrass, they're very, very competitive. However, at Hawkins, we are gonna undertake a new project to try and combat invasive annual grasses. So we're gonna be doing some herbicide applications to try and control invasive annual grasses, followed by revegetation, because Hawkins Range Reserve, we've identified it as a priority restoration landscape for many different reasons. One, there's water, there's perennial waterways that run through it, south fork of Daniels Creek. There's also a lot of biological diversity there. In some of our lower reserves, there isn't a lot of diversity due to the invasives, but at Hawkins Range Reserve, there's kind of a little bit of both.
We have a chance.
We have a chance at Hawkins Range Reserve, and it seems worthwhile to put restoration dollars into that area.
Cause you did like a smaller sample of that on Table Rock, didn't you, a few years ago after the fire?
Yes, we did a lot of sampling at Table Rock after the fire, and our restoration
That's
was very, very successful there. But I think that was for several factors that maybe don't have a lot to do with me. It was Snowmageddon the year it happened, so I think those seedlings received a lot of precipitation and snow runoff. So the weather.
Apocalypse happened.
Yep, exactly. And then there was also a lot of sagebrush on the landscape prior to the fire. And there's been a lot of studies and papers published about how sagebrush, if there's sagebrush prior to a fire or disturbance, the chance of it coming back is significantly higher. And there also is no history of grazing on Table Rock, so I think we had a lot of factors in our, in our favor to make that be such a successful project. That was very, very successful. You helped. I have a little bit. I did plant, some of the plants I planted are still out there.
It's a little bit off the subject, but I know, you notice along the trails where you have the little, I think there's sagebrush that you planted with the little green.
Yeah.
How successful is that?
So we actually did a study with another professor at Boise State. Her name is Dr. Megan Coutu, and she runs an unmanned aerial vehicle, a drone program. And we did a planting with her at Military Reserve in Bucktail Trail, when the new pedestrian only trail was installed 2.1.
Okay.
And we planted specifically at different distances on both of those trails, so to look at how use impacts sagebrush seedlings next to trails. And we found that use really impacts sagebrush seedlings next to trails. There's a lot more of those seedlings that survive on the downhill biking only versus 2-point trail, where almost none of the seedlings survived. And my hypothesis is it's human and dog traffic. It's really hard on those newly planted seedlings. Yes, the answer is they do not do that well right next to the trail. I wish they did better. But we will, once we wrap up with Megan, we'll know a distance at which they statistically survive better, and then we can work off of that metric to hopefully make better use of our sagebrush in the future.
Sure, thank you.
Well, I just want to thank Dr. DeGraff and her team and just for coming in. I think this was really interesting and really educational to see a process from start to finish. So really appreciate all your work and just thanks.
Thank you for your support.
Yeah.
It's been really good. It's educated a lot of students as well, which is really good. A lot of people ready to get jobs. It's almost up.
That was all.
Okay, so are we? We done today?
May I make a motion to adjourn?
Yes, I would love a motion to.
I motion to adjourn.
All in favor? Aye. We're adjourned.